Hey guys, Drifter here. Instead of yet another gaming video, today I have for you a psychological topic video. I want to talk about mean world syndrome, and the shortest possible explanation of what this is that it's when you start perceiving the world around you as being much more negative and hostile than it really is. This is something that I have personally experienced on and off in my life as I've struggled with various things that I've talked about here on the channel, and especially during the 2020 COVID pandemic and the harassment issues, I started experiencing this mean world syndrome. I suspect a lot of you have also felt this, or maybe even experiencing this without knowing it, based on what I'm seeing going on social media. Lots of social media posts, not only in the outer Twitter sphere and Facebook, but inside of this little community as well, have been far more negative recently. And I think that COVID and being stuck at home and a lot of the negativities of 2020 and early 2021 have started driving people a little bit crazy. So today, let's do a deep dive into mean world syndrome, and maybe I can help you clear up your mind just a little bit. I should probably mention in the beginning of the video that this is not an official syndrome. This is not a diagnosis that you can get. You can't go to a doctor and be like, my God, this is the worst case of mean world syndrome I've ever seen. It's not in the DSM. This is more of an unofficial diagnosis, or the name of a cognitive bias. More technically speaking, it is a cognitive bias, which in most cases is also a logical fallacy, but it's just a very common phrase that explains a mindset you see in a lot of different places. The origin of this phrase was research into violent media that started in the late 60s and early 70s when TV was starting to get a little bit more actiony and a little bit more crazy, and it was meant to explain why people, more specifically Americans, were perceiving the world to be more negative than it really was, and their suspicion was it was due to the negativity in media that they were consuming. And I think this is something a lot of you are familiar with. The news mostly reports bad stuff because we, as people, our minds, we like to sort of scan our environment for various threats and various bad things because we want to learn how to avoid harm to ourselves, and we want to know what's coming next, and we don't as much scan for opportunities, but threats really stand out in our brain. So the news just kind of magnifies that. And even if you want to just don't watch the news, the media that we consume, not just here in America, but around the world, are primarily stories of conflict between one party and another and some kind of resolution, usually a violent one, stories about heroism, tragedy, struggle, overcoming these kind of bad things. And even if the good guys win in the end, there's still a lot of violence and negativity and struggle along the way. So an increase in media consumption can affect your attitudes about the world, and more specifically and importantly for later, not just negatively. It is possible to consume enough positive media, or media of a certain topic or certain desire or certain subsection, that can start moving your mind in ways that you wouldn't have gone on your own. So the initial research was done to support what they called cultivation theory, which was basically that the television or the media that you consume cultivates in your mind and helps you create or understand the reality around you more than your experiences of kind of being in that reality. So basically, according to the original researchers many decades ago, the more TV you watch, the more you will believe that the TV accurately reflects the world around you, which kind of makes sense. If you're not living in the world, if you're not engaging with it, if you're not out and about and instead you're viewing it through, a little window on a box, that's your only experience. It's kind of like, I believe it's Socrates, the shadows in the cave, that the people in the cave, their wisdom was all about perceiving the shadows and they didn't know what the real thing was. A similar kind of thing can happen with the TV, that the more you view it, it becomes what you see. It becomes your lens. It becomes your reality. So in this case, and it's often negative, since TV and news focuses on negativity and our stories focus on hero struggles of sorts, increased consumption of television media is almost always associated with higher fears of victimization because people are literally seeing more threats in the world. So I've talked about TV a lot. That's because we're talking about old research from the 70s. Don't worry, this is going to move into modern times really soon. I promise you. But in this specific instance, basically people were seeing more threats. They were learning more things that could hurt them, learning more things that could harm them. They were hearing stories of other people that got hurt by various things. So they're perceiving more threats in the world. And the researchers believe that increase of media consumption, and in this case social media can do it too, led to a mean world syndrome where you viewed the world as being meaner, nastier, uglier, more violent than it objectively is. And they also came to a second and much more scary conclusion for me, which was they believe that who tells the stories of a culture is who really governs human behavior in the long run. So obviously, right now, you think that what governs human behavior is our government, our police, our authorities, whoever they may be. Here on YouTube, that's a very random set of authorities of what you can and can't do. It's very frustrating to work with. But that's not really it. It's not who has the power, but who tells the story. Because children will grow up reading and watching and experiencing stories from people outside of that power structure, and when they come to power, they will try to recreate that, or at least be influenced in some way in their actions. So the people, the storytellers, are really dictating our future culture. And the researchers believe that in the past, it was primarily the community around people. The community would have their own local legends, myths, and heroes. The church was very influential, trying to teach people morality. Government, obviously, parental figures, school, stuff like that. These are the traditional good guys, or who you would think you would want really influencing people. But the reality is that these days, all of that is gone. The vast majority of the media we consume, the stories that we tell and share with others, are governed or created by gigantic multinational corporations that only have a single motive, which is profit, and absolutely no social responsibility whatsoever. So if violence sells, great, we're going to do more violence, and there'll be a whole generation of people that grow up thinking violence. That's kind of what they were afraid about, is like kids going crazy. Obviously, that didn't really happen, but they did start seeing the world more negatively, and it still comes up today that people think that our world is worse off than it's ever been, and that's not really true, except for global warming, but that's a totally different video. That's kind of the background into the topic. I know I've talked quite a lot. I'm looking at my timer down here. That's a lot of background. But now I want to take this into much less official territory and talk about social media, because all of this original research was done well before social media ever existed. And you're here on YouTube right now. You're watching a YouTube video. Some of you might have come in from Twitter. Some of you might have just jumped off of TikTok to check this out. So you know that social media can be very bad, very mean. You know what social media toxicity looks like. And I believe that social media is intentionally designed by the companies, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, whatever, to provoke the most extreme emotional responses possible, because that keeps the users engaged, it keeps them watching longer, and it keeps them typing and clicking ads and coming back for more, because these emotional responses are so strong. So the people make the content, the people consume the content, and it's a very toxic cycle that kind of gets people to spin their wheels and do really crazy things while it's making a ton of money for whatever company designed this system. Since we are generating the content, me and you, this is a piece of content as well, and whatever you share in social media is ultimately a piece of content. Most of us are trying to make it as entertaining as possible. One of the worst things that I can do as a creator, and one of the worst feelings that you can have as a friend or family member that's sharing something, is when you share something and the response is just, okay. Like, you share something that's boring. Being boring is really bad. It's really hard. It doesn't feel good, right? So we're trying to make it exciting, and in most cases, that means make it as extreme as possible. In the case of Twitter and some of the more political platforms, there's motivations there for the extremity as well, because you want to spur actions, but it's still kind of the same thing. And on top of that, instead of being on the news, which most of us, I believe, have learned to distrust over the years, and most of us aren't like really taking the red or blue pills from whatever our little weird networks are telling us, we're seeing real people say and do things, and it usually looks a little more like real because it's really real people there doing it on the ground, filming it cheaply. You can look at it from multiple angles and stuff like that. And I'm sure that almost everybody watching this video has seen something on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram that you just thought was totally real and was really cool and turned out to be fake. Even if it's something as a fake product or an April Fool's joke, it could be something more serious like a piece of news or science or whatever. But we've all been bamboozled by something. I have too. I'm not perfect. I am not a super genius that can see through all of this. Some things totally fool me. I think most of us can accept that reality, but there's a second reality that's a little bit harder, and that's that there's probably lots of stuff that we have all seen that we think is still real, but is at least in some way inaccurate if it's not totally fake. It could be exaggerated, it could be set up, it could be literally fake, CGI, Photoshop, whatever. There's almost no way, as much social media as I consume, that I just haven't seen things that I just didn't really want to research and be like, okay, yeah, cool, and just moved on, and it just a little bit of bad information sitting up there in the brain. And because of the way these platforms work, they want to keep you engaged. They want to keep you kind of going constantly, right? So we're constantly playing with it. You're fiddling with your phone every 5 minutes looking for messages and stuff. And we will see this kind of false reality. It can either be false for like political reasons or just somebody wants to make like a cool YouTube video so they clickbait it and hype it up. But we see these falsities with shocking frequency to where it skews our perspective of the entire world. It's like TV news from the olden days, but on steroids. And I think that the problem that we experienced in 2020 and early 2021 is that a lot of people were locked up in their houses. They lost their jobs. They couldn't see their family members. They were literally stuck inside, kind of like I was. Some people had lockdown. Some people did it voluntarily. This kind of psychological pressure is very bad on people, and it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It was a nightmare, because then anytime somebody, and this is basically my story, I would be in my house, month number 6 inside, bored, can't see my friends, can't see my family, nothing to do. I'm like, okay, well, let me open up social media and see what's going on. Well, since social media, to survive on that platform, you have to be extreme. It was just one extreme thing after another. And since I wasn't engaging in the real world and going out, my window to the world was this little phone. I would just This was it. This was really my little window for the world here. And I would just kind of focus in on that, and it started skewing my perspective of things. And I personally started falling into some of the bad world syndrome, which is kind of why I wanted to make this video. Another area that this also applies is, and we're getting even further out into the theoretical zone here. Don't take this as the gospel truth. This isn't medical advice. I'm not a doctor, okay? But it is often discussed when you're talking to victims of abuse and serious trauma like PTSD, child abuse, things like that, people that get stuck with toxic family until they're 18 and they can finally move out. And these type of people, because of their negative experiences with their immediate surroundings, also develop mean world syndrome. As we all know, luck by its nature is totally random. And some people are just going to be lucky and they're going to have a great life and not really a lot of struggles. And then a lot of people, some people are going to have a lot of bad things happen to them for not a lot of good reasons. And it kind of sucks. But those people that have, on this side, I'm getting my hands a little mixed up here, that have more bad experiences than others, perhaps one after another in a row, they start skewing their perspective of the world because their normal is really bad. Their normal is way worse than what you're experiencing, so they start seeing the entire world around them as bad. It starts getting harder for people that experience abuse and trauma over and over and over again to see good things in the world, because they're constantly searching for the bad things in order to try to avoid it as a survival mechanism. It ultimately becomes harder to see the good in people. It becomes harder to see the good in a situation. It becomes harder to see good opportunities, and you're mostly just out there trying to deal with the baddies and the bad stuff. And of course, as we mentioned before, social media is just like pouring gas on this fire. It just amplifies everything up to the maximum because it has to be extreme to survive. And there's a subset of people that have just one really bad traumatic experience. This is basically PTSD, but you can have just one bad thing happen that kind of skews them permanently. Their whole perspective changes about the world based on this one bad thing. And I think 2020 did this to a lot of us. I think a lot of us experienced stress last year and earlier this year. At least personally for me, things are getting better now, but a lot of us really struggled in ways that we had never struggled before, especially in the first world. These were the product shortages. Am I going to eat? How do I deal with the cold weather without my first world luxuries? And I don't know what I'm going to do for a job. And my family has COVID and my grandma died of COVID. And this is all really bad stuff. And most of us had never really experienced this before. So we got hammered over and over and over again with some negative experience. And we were stuck in our homes. So when we open up our phone or computer or TV to see the outside world, well, that's just more negative media flooding in. And I think a lot of us are experiencing mean world syndrome right now, more so than really ever before in my lifetime. And not just strangers, but me too. I've talked about this a little bit, but it was a rough year for me, okay? I didn't like being stuck in my house for 14, 15 months because of COVID. I didn't like seeing COVID turn into a bitter political issue when it was more of a straightforward scientific one. I didn't like watching riots on TV all summer and then a Capitol riot on TV all winter. I didn't like watching this horrifically, bitterly divided election that was dangerous to our entire democracy. More personally, I didn't like being harassed almost every other day. That was kind of the other end of like the personal spectrum coming in. Almost all of my inputs were very negative, and over time, this very much so wore me down. As much as I like to sit here on YouTube and be like, oh, I'm Mr. Logical and I understand this and talk about psychological that, it's still a person, still vulnerable in a lot of ways. So over time, it wore me down. And you saw in my last video where I was talking about getting vaccinated and how I just kind of don't care about unvaccinated people anymore, or people, or what is it, anti-vax people is what it was. I think I just said that if there's adults out there now that don't want to get a vaccine because of some gobbledygook they read on Facebook and they get sick and die, that's really a them problem and not a me problem, and I don't care. And I think I'm still of that attitude, but I'm able to realize that that attitude is very toxic. It is very mean world syndrome, and it's very wrong in a lot of ways. It's also something that's not normal for a person like me to say, a guy who tries to be very positive on this channel. And a great number of you pointed that out to me. A lot of you told me like, holy crap, dude, you've turned into your own villain, like for real. So I had to take a step back and kind of analyze myself, and I realized, given some time to think, that I have fallen into the bad world syndrome. That I'm out there looking for threats that probably aren't real, at least anymore. I'm assuming the worst in people in most situations instead of being realistic or practical. I expect the worst outcome in a lot of situations. I think that there's a great number of threats and dangers out there in the outside world that are probably exaggerated if I have to think about it logically. And ultimately, I've turned more negative than I used to be because I've genuinely begun to think that the entire world around me is a bad place. I feel that. I feel that in here in the middle of this little yin-yang heart of mine. But I know that up here in my brain that it's not true. And this is where being a little bit smarter, this is where being exposed to a topic like this can be helpful to you, because you can use that logic to your advantage to heal and perhaps change your opinion. Logically speaking, I know the things I see on TV and social media aren't like really real in the traditional sense. I understand that they're exaggerated. I understand that some of them are fabricated. I understand that they are designed to provoke a response, and that it's not really representative of the real world, or at least maybe just a super tiny little part of it that I will probably never experience. So that's comforting in a way. It's also comforting to know that things like hunger, starvation, famine are way on the way down, historically speaking. Crime in the US is massively down, and not just in the US, but by and large globally. Different countries have instabilities and problems, so there are definitely outliers in places where crime is not down at all. But by and large, Western world, most stable countries, crime today, violent crime, way lower than it has been at almost any point in human history. Our food supply is great. Disasters still happen with pretty normal frequency, but our technology for saving people is better, so disasters are less disastrous. And even war and global conflict is now less than it has been in a very long time. I will admit, maybe this is the bad world syndrome again, that in the last couple of years, it seems like our conflict has picked up a little bit. But let's say, we were down here flat on this baseline, and it went up to kind of like here. Well, not many years ago, it would have been like way up here. So even if we're at a local high, it's still way lower than where it used to be, which is really comforting. I know that the world is reopening again. People are healing. People are going to go out there and meet their neighbors and friends and family and be able to engage and get that social contact that they need. And I know I sure need it. That's something that I definitely need in my life. So I'm hoping and I'm thinking that over time, people are going to start feeling better. They're going to start connecting a little bit better, start going to be a little bit less crazy and extreme on social media. And I also know that there are always new opportunities for positive changes, not just for me, but for any of you. So while knowing this may not make me feel normal again overnight, keeping it in my mind will help keep my mind open to the possibilities of good things. And in the long run, I believe that the bad world syndrome that I'm personally experiencing will slowly fade away. And I think for a lot of you, as you re-enter the world, reopen your life and kind of get back out there and get moving again, it's going to be the same thing. And just knowing about a topic like this so that you can apply some logic to an emotion can help temper your subconscious and conscious responses and maybe make you feel a little bit better about the world around you. So things might feel bad right now. Things might feel rough. They might feel it here in the heart. But the reality is, if you got a scientist out here to measure the world, it's doing better than it has been in a long time. So let's hope that trend continues. And I hope that this educated some of you about the mean world syndrome. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.